For decades, Chris Rock was the man who could make anyone laugh. The sharp-tongued comedian who turned pain into punchlines and truth into laughter. From the streets of Brooklyn to the bright lights of Hollywood, Rock's rise seemed unstoppable. His jokes about race, fame, and life cut through the noise with raw honesty, making him one of the most influential comedians of his generation. But behind the confident smile and quick wit, there was a side of Chris few ever saw, a man fighting battles far deeper than the laughter could hide. At 60, Chris Rock stands as a legend of comedy, but his journey has been marked by heartbreak, betrayal, and unimaginable personal pain. The world knows him as the man who took a slap on live television and stood tall, but that moment barely scratches the surface of the struggles he's faced. From a lonely childhood filled with bullying and racism to a career haunted by heartbreak and loss, Rock's story isn't just about fame. It's about endurance, redemption, and the price of turning your own trauma into entertainment. As the cameras fade and the laughter quiets, what remains is a man reflecting on the choices, heartbreaks, and tragedies that shaped his life. This is the story of how one of the greatest comedians in history learned that even the funniest man alive cannot laugh away the pain that life delivers, and why Chris Rock's journey at 60 is far more heartbreaking than anyone ever imagined. Long before Chris Rock became one of the most respected voices in comedy, he was just a quiet kid from Brooklyn trying to survive. Born in Andrews, South Carolina, and raised in the working-class neighborhoods of New York, Chris didn't grow up with the glamour or privilege that many comedians later found. His early life was defined by struggle, poverty, racism, and an environment that seemed determined to break his spirit before he ever found his voice. As a small, skinny boy attending predominantly white schools, Chris became an easy target for bullying. He has spoken candidly about those painful years, describing how he was tormented and beaten by classmates who saw him as different. The constant abuse wasn't just physical, it was emotional. "I was picked on every day," Rock once said. "It got so bad I had to be escorted home by teachers." For a young boy trying to find his identity, those experiences left scars that would never fully heal. Comedy, at first, wasn't about fame or attention. It was survival. Chris realized that if he could make people laugh, he could make them stop hurting him, even for a moment. Humor became his armor. By his teenage years, he was performing in small clubs, using his pain as material, his jokes dripping with truth and defiance. Every laugh he earned felt like reclaiming a piece of the dignity that had been stolen from him as a child. But even as his talent grew, so did his awareness of how unfair the world could be. Growing up during a time when racism was still openly tolerated, Chris developed a sharp, unfiltered perspective that would later define his comedy. He didn't just want to be funny, he wanted to be honest. His jokes weren't about escaping reality. They were about confronting it, yet the same pain that made him great also isolated him. Chris never forgot what it felt like to be unwanted. He often spoke about how those early traumas shaped the way he viewed relationships, success, and trust. "When you've been made to feel small your whole life," he once said, "you spend the rest of your life trying to prove you're not." That desire to prove himself became both his greatest strength and his deepest wound. By the late 1980s, Chris Rock's raw energy caught the attention of Hollywood. He joined Saturday Night Live, where he quickly became one of the most exciting young comedians in America. But behind the scenes, he felt out of place. Surrounded by white colleagues and writing rooms that didn't always understand his perspective, Chris often battled feelings of isolation. He later admitted that during his SNL years, he felt invisible, overshadowed, unheard, and misunderstood. It was around this time that Rock realized the world of fame wasn't the escape he imagined. Success brought recognition, but it didn't heal the emotional wounds that fame couldn't touch. He was living his dream, but inside, he still felt like that bullied kid from Brooklyn, fighting to belong, fighting to be seen. When he finally left SNL and began focusing on his stand-up specials, everything changed. He poured his truth into his performances, using comedy as a weapon in therapy. Specials like Bring the Pain and Bigger and Blacker didn't just make audiences laugh, they made them think. Chris was no longer just a comedian. He was a voice of truth, a mirror reflecting society's uncomfortable realities. But success couldn't erase the loneliness that followed him. For every roar of applause, there was silence waiting backstage, a reminder that laughter, no matter how loud, fades quickly. What few knew at the time was that Chris Rock was already carrying the early weight of the tragedies that would define the next chapters of his life. By the mid-1990s, Chris Rock had cemented himself as one of the sharpest minds in comedy. His HBO specials, Bring the Pain, 1996, and Bigger and Blacker, 1999, weren't just funny, they were cultural earthquakes. He wasn't just telling jokes. He was dissecting society, race, relationships, and hypocrisy in ways no one else dared. His performances were raw, fearless, and brutally honest, and they earned him Emmy Awards, critical acclaim, and the admiration of legends like Eddie Murphy and Richard Pryor. On stage, Chris Rock looked untouchable, the confident king of comedy. But off stage, the reality was far more fragile. Behind the fame, Chris was quietly struggling with the same emotional isolation that had haunted him since childhood. The spotlight amplified everything: his insecurities, his need for validation, and his fear of losing control. While fans saw a man who had it all, Chris was battling private storms that few people could see. In interviews, he hinted at depression and loneliness, often using humor to mask the pain. You'd be surprised how many people make millions of people laugh and still cry themselves to sleep. He once said with a half-smile, his personal life seemed stable when he married Malak Compton in 1996. To the world, they were the picture of success, a power couple raising 2 daughters in a beautiful home, living the American dream. But behind the closed doors of their mansion, cracks were beginning to form. The pressures of fame, constant touring, and the emotional distance that came with success began to erode the foundation of their marriage. Chris later admitted that fame had made him selfish, that he had begun prioritizing his career over his family, often using work as an excuse to avoid intimacy and accountability. He confessed in his later years that during the height of his success, he wasn't the husband or father he should have been. In a raw interview, Rock revealed that he had been unfaithful multiple times during his marriage, calling it one of his greatest regrets. "You think being famous means you can get away with anything," he said. "But it doesn't fix what's broken inside you. It just hides it for a while." When his marriage finally ended in 2016, after nearly 2 decades together, Chris hit one of the lowest points of his life. The divorce was messy, emotional, and deeply public. The man who made a career out of laughing at life suddenly found himself unable to find humor in his own. He described it as a wake-up call, forcing him to confront the emotional immaturity and unresolved pain that had been controlling him for years. The fallout of the divorce forced Rock into therapy for the first time in his life, a decision he would later credit with saving him. In therapy, he was diagnosed with a nonverbal learning disorder, something that explained why he struggled to pick up on emotional cues and often misread relationships. It was a revelation that gave context to decades of confusion and pain. "I realized I'd been living with something my whole life without knowing it," he admitted. "It made me understand why I pushed people away, why I never felt fully connected." As he worked through his past, Chris began to see how deeply his childhood traumas had influenced his adult life, how the bullied boy had become a man afraid of vulnerability, hiding behind jokes instead of confronting pain. Fame had given him the platform to speak, but not the peace to listen to himself. The world saw Chris Rock the performer, powerful, confident, and unbreakable. But behind that stage persona was a man wrestling with guilt, self-discovery, and the realization that success doesn't protect anyone from heartbreak. His rise to fame had been extraordinary, but the cost of that success was beginning to surface. And the next chapter of his life would test him in ways even he couldn't joke his way out of. For decades, Chris Rock's sharp tongue and lightning-fast wit became his greatest weapons. He used comedy not just to entertain, but to survive. Yet behind that laughter lay deep wounds, scars that fame could never fully heal. Those who knew him best often said that Rock's comedy was a reflection of pain he never truly escaped. And nowhere was that more evident than in the years following his public humiliation at the 2022 Academy Awards. When the infamous onstage incident with Will Smith occurred, the world erupted. Memes, debates, and headlines exploded across every screen. But for Chris Rock, it wasn't just another viral moment. It was a psychological earthquake. In that single, shocking instant, he became both the victim of violence and the target of endless scrutiny. Everyone had an opinion and everyone felt entitled to share it. Rock, however, chose silence, at least for a while. Behind closed doors, he struggled to process what had happened. Friends later revealed that the slap triggered unresolved trauma from his childhood. Growing up in a tough Brooklyn neighborhood, Chris was relentlessly bullied. He was often beaten by white classmates who targeted him for being different. Those early experiences left him with trust issues and deep insecurities, ones he masked through humor. Decades later, being struck in front of millions reopened old emotional wounds he thought he had buried long ago. In interviews months later, Rock admitted he had sought therapy to deal with the incident. But not just any therapy. He began EMDR, a trauma treatment designed to help people recover from deeply distressing memories. "I'm not a victim," he said, "but that hurt." His words were calm, but his eyes told another story. Even as he returned to the stage, delivering jokes that dissected the slap with razor-sharp precision, it was clear that laughter had become his shield once again. Privately, the toll was immense. Rock's relationships became strained. He avoided interviews and public appearances for a time, preferring isolation. Even his friends noticed a change in his demeanor, less playful, more reflective. The man who once thrived on connecting with audiences now seemed guarded, as if every word might reopen a wound. But the emotional scars didn't start or end with that night. His 2016 divorce from Malak Compton, after nearly 2 decades of marriage, had already shattered his world. Chris later admitted that he had been unfaithful, describing himself as a man addicted to attention. The split left him broken and guilt-ridden, forced to face the consequences of fame's temptations. He spoke openly about attending therapy to address his infidelity and ego, saying, "It's hard to be a good person when you're famous." These words revealed a man who was painfully self-aware, yet trapped by the very success he had worked so hard to achieve. Comedy had always been his outlet, his way of turning pain into power. But as he got older, that transformation became harder. The laughter came at a cost. Sleepless nights, loneliness, and a haunting fear that he would never be truly loved for who he was, only for who the world thought he was. Despite all this, Chris Rock never completely lost his spark. He turned his heartbreak into art once more, releasing his special selective outrage, where he finally addressed the infamous slap. The performance was raw, unfiltered, and deeply human. He spoke not from anger but from survival, reclaiming his voice on his own terms. For many fans, it was a moment of closure. But for Rock, it was just another chapter in a lifetime of learning how to heal in public. Still, behind every laugh, there remains a flicker of sadness. A man who has made millions laugh continues to wrestle with the silence that follows the applause, the silence where truth and pain live side by side. Chris Rock may have built a career out of finding humor in hardship, but the tragedy of his story is that those hardships never really left him. In the wake of all his pain, Chris Rock began to realize that survival alone wasn't enough. He needed peace. The laughter, the fame, the lights. They had once defined him, but they no longer filled the emptiness that had slowly grown inside. After decades of using humor as armor, Rock started to confront the truth. Beneath the jokes was a man exhausted from always pretending to be okay. The aftermath of the 2022 Oscars changed him in ways few could understand. For months, he turned down interviews and public appearances. He wanted space, not from the media, but from the noise. The world had watched him get slapped and then laughed, analyzed, and criticized him as if he were a character in a show. But when the camera stopped rolling, Chris was left to pick up the pieces alone. He later said that while the world had moved on, he hadn't. "That night lives with me," he admitted during one of his shows. "But I learned something. You can't control what happens to you, only how you respond." That lesson became the foundation of his healing. Rock began focusing on self-reflection, meditation, and his daughters, Lola and Zara, who had quietly been his anchors through everything. He once said fatherhood gave his life structure, that it kept him grounded when fame tried to pull him apart. Spending time with them helped him remember what truly mattered. Not applause, not revenge, but love and understanding. Professionally, Chris Rock's comeback was nothing short of remarkable. When he released his Netflix special Selective Outrage in 2023, he didn't shy away from the pain. Instead, he faced it head-on. The jokes were sharp, but they carried depth. He transformed a moment of humiliation into one of empowerment, showing the world that even the most public pain could be turned into purpose. Critics praised the special for its courage and authenticity, calling it one of Rock's most personal works to date. But beyond the stage, Rock's evolution became even more profound. He began speaking openly about mental health, masculinity, and vulnerability, topics many men in his position avoided. He admitted that therapy had changed his life, helping him break cycles of anger and self-sabotage that had followed him since childhood. He encouraged others, especially men of color, to seek help without shame. "We're taught to be tough," he said, "but real strength is knowing when to heal. Even so, not everything was easy. Fame has a way of keeping old wounds fresh. Every time he appeared on screen or social media, reminders of that Oscar night resurfaced. But over time, Rock stopped trying to erase the past. Instead, he chose to own it. He began focusing more on directing and producing, mentoring young comedians, and using his influence to help others find their voice. Today, Chris Rock stands as a man who has seen both the brightest and darkest sides of success. The tragedy of his life isn't that he fell, it's that he had to keep falling in front of millions just to learn how to stand up again. Yet, in that struggle lies his redemption. He's no longer just the comedian who makes the world laugh. He's the man who taught it something about resilience. At 60, Rock carries his scars like badges of wisdom. He still jokes, still performs, but his tone has changed. There's more reflection now, more honesty, more grace. The pain hasn't vanished, but it no longer controls him. After years of heartbreak, betrayal, and humiliation, Chris Rock has finally found what he was always searching for: peace. And maybe that's the most powerful punchline of all, that even after the world tried to define him by one tragic moment, Chris Rock chose to define himself by how he rose from it.